Have you ever imagined a country where 8-year-old children are separated from their families to train in extreme cold conditions? A place where men wrestle half-naked in temperatures of -30 degrees and are revered as heroes? Welcome to Mongolia, the country that was once the largest empire in history, but today hides an obscure reality of extreme contrasts. While the capital Ulaanbaatar modernizes with skyscrapers and luxury stores, half the population still lives in traditional tents called jairs, without access to running water or sewage, in one of the coldest places on the planet. The gap between rich and poor in Mongolia is one of the most extreme in the world. While an elite gets rich from the exploitation of minerals such as coal, copper, and gold, most of the population struggles to survive on less than $400 a month. And here's something you probably don't know. This land of Genghis Khan's descendants faces a devastating environmental crisis. The Gobi Desert advances more than 150 meters per year, swallowing ancient pastures, forcing nomads to abandon their ancient way of life, and causing deadly sandstorms. Meanwhile, pollution in the capital is now worse than in Beijing, turning the air into poison during the brutal winters. Get ready to discover a Mongolia you've never seen in documentaries, a country extremes, squeezed between China and Russia, with vast reserves of rare minerals coveted by the entire world, where the glorious past contrasts with challenging present and an uncertain future. Mongolia is a territorial giant wedge between two colossi, Russia to the north and China to the south. With 1.5 million square kilometers, it's the 18th largest country in the world, larger than countries like Peru, Egypt, and Turkey combined. But despite its impressive size, the population is only 3.3 million people, making it one of the least densely populated countries on the planet. The Mongolian climate is not for the faint-hearted. In winter, temperatures can plummet to -50 degrees, especially in the capital Ulaanbaatar, considered the coldest capital in the world. In summer, the contrast is brutal, with temperatures that can exceed 40 degrees in the Gobi Desert, which occupies about 30% of the territory. Speaking of Gobi, this desert is growing at an alarming rate due to climate change and overgrazing. This has forced many nomads to abandon their traditional lifestyle and migrate to the overcrowded capital, where more than 45% of the country's population is concentrated, often living in precarious conditions. Besides the desert, Mongolia's geography includes vast steppes, imposing mountains like the Altai Range and boreal forests in the north. Mongolia's rivers are unique. They don't flow into oceans but into internal basins, creating a closed hydrological system that is extremely vulnerable to pollution. Geopolitically, Mongolia's position is as challenging as its climate. Surrounded by two superpowers, the country performs a delicate diplomatic dance, trying to maintain its independence while taking advantage of the economic opportunities offered by its gigantic neighbors. This geopolitical game becomes even more complex when we consider the country's mineral wealth, a buried treasure that awakens international greed. Mongolia's history is an epic of conquest, glory, and decline. It all began in the steppes, where nomadic tribes war among themselves for millennia. But it was in the 13th century that a leader named Temujin unified these tribes and became known as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. What Genghis Khan built was simply the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. The Mongols conquered territories in impressive speed, using revolutionary military tactics. They were masters of mounted warfare, with archers capable of shooting accurately even at a gallop, and use impeccable military organization based on the decimal system. But there's a dark side to these conquests. It's estimated that the campaigns of Genghis Khan and his successors resulted in the deaths of 40 million people, about 10% of the world population at the time. Entire cities were razed when they refused to surrender, creating psychological terror that facilitated future conquests. After Genghis Khan's death, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, with his grandson Kublai Khan establishing the Yuan dynasty in China. As the centuries passed, the empire fragmented, and in the 17th century, the region we now know as Mongolia fell under Chinese rule. The 20th century brought dramatic changes. With the fall of the Qing dynasty in China, Mongolia declared independence in 1911, but soon found itself involved in the Russian Revolution. In 1924, the country became the second communist nation in the world after the Soviet Union. For 7 decades, Mongolia was a Soviet satellite. Nomads were forced to settle in collective farms. Traditional Mongolian script was replaced by the Cyrillic alphabet, and thousands of Buddhist monks were executed in brutal purges. Traditional culture was almost completely stifled. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 left Mongolia adrift. Without Soviet economic support, the country collapsed with rampant inflation and shortages of basic products. It was in this vacuum that modern Mongolia emerged, a fragile democracy struggling to find its place in a globalized world. If you're the type who seeks authentic experiences and is tired of crowded tourist destinations, Mongolia offers something completely different. Here, tourism isn't about lines at museums or photos at famous spots. It's about immersion in one of the last truly nomadic cultures on the planet. The great attraction is, without doubt, the untouched vastness of the steppes. Imagine yourself riding through endless plains with a sky and Earth seemed to merge on the horizon. The Naadam Festival, held every July, is a must for anyone wanting to dive into Mongolian culture. This centuries-old event celebrates the 3 masculine skills: wrestling, archery, and horse racing. The most impressive part? The races where children between 5 and 13 are the jockeys, covering distances of up to 30 kilometers at frightening speeds. For wildlife lovers, Hustai National Park is home to the last Przewalski horses, a species that was almost extinct. The Gobi Desert offers surreal landscapes with golden dunes, red rock formations, and dinosaur fossils. Some of the most important in the world were found there. A unique experience is spending the night in a traditional GR. Many nomadic families open their homes to travelers, offering traditional food like buzz, meat dumplings, and arag, fermented mare's milk, an acquired taste, believe me. But let's talk about some practical challenges. The tourist infrastructure outside the capital is almost non-existent. Paved roads are rare, and you'll probably spend hours in 4x4 vehicles bouncing along dusty trails. The bathrooms? Most of the time, you'll have very basic structures or simply nature. The climate also requires preparation. If you go in summer, June to August, which is the best time, prepare for drastic temperature variations. It can be 30 degrees Celsius during the day and drop to almost 0 degrees Celsius at night. And don't forget the repellent. Mosquitoes in areas near lakes can be relentless. As for safety, Mongolia is generally a safe country for tourists, but avoid walking alone at night in Ulaanbaatar, where alcoholism and opportunistic crimes are growing problems. And if you're invited to drink vodka with Mongolians, know that refusing can be considered rude, but accepting means several toasts. Mongolia's economy is like a mineral-powered roller coaster. The country sits on an underground treasure valued at more than $2.75 trillion US, including some of the world's largest reserves of copper, coal, gold, and rare earths. The Oyu Tolgoi mine alone contains one of the world's largest copper and gold reserves and represents more than 30% of the country's GDP. But this mineral wealth has created what economists call a resource curse. The country has become extremely dependent on the extractive sector and vulnerable to price fluctuations in the international market. When China, which buys more than 90% of Mongolian exports, slowed its economy in 2016, Mongolia went into crisis and needed an IMF bailout. For the ordinary citizen, this economic roller coaster translates into uncertainty. The average monthly salary in Mongolia is approximately 1.2 million tugriks, about $350 US, but this average hides enormous inequality. While mining sector executives can earn international salaries, many Mongolians in rural areas live on less than $200 US per month. The cost of living varies drastically between the capital and the interior. In Ulaanbaatar, a one-bedroom apartment in the center can cost between $800,000 and $1.5 million tugriks per month, $235 US to $440 US, while monthly food expenses for one person are around 500,000 tugriks, $147 US. In winter months, heating becomes a crucial expense. Many families spend almost 20% of their income just to avoid freezing when temperatures drop below minus 30 degrees Celsius. For nomads, the economy works differently. Their wealth is measured in head of cattle, not money. A family of herders may own hundreds of animals, sheep, goats, horses, yaks, and camels, but have very little cash. However, this traditional lifestyle is threatened by climate change and desertification that have killed millions of animals, leading entire families to bankruptcy. A recent trend that offers hope is the growth of digital entrepreneurship. Young Mongolians are creating startups and offering remote services, taking advantage of the fact that the country has a literacy rate of 98%. This may be a key to diversifying the economy beyond minerals. Behind the image of free nomads riding through the steppes, contemporary Mongolia hides a complex reality of corruption, inequality, and social problems that rarely reach the eyes of the world. Corruption is endemic and affects all levels of government. In 2019, a scandal shook the country when it was discovered that politicians had diverted millions of dollars from a fund intended to support small businesses. The case, known as the SME Fund scandal, led to massive protests in below-zero temperatures. The mining industry, the main economic driver of the country, is particularly vulnerable. Obscure contracts with foreign companies have raised suspicions of bribes and favoritism. The case of the Tavan Talgoy mine, one of the largest coal reserves in the world, is emblematic. After years of secret negotiations, many Mongolians believe their national wealth is being sold for peanuts. Perhaps the most urgent social problem is alcoholism. Mongolia has one of the highest rates of alcohol consumption in the world, with devastating consequences. Domestic violence, directly linked to alcohol abuse, affects almost 1 in 3 women. The problem worsens during the long, isolated winters. Pollution in Ulaanbaatar has reached apocalyptic levels. During winter, when families in the Gur districts burn coal to heat their tents, the concentration of particles in the air can reach 133 times the limit recommended by the WHO. This results in an epidemic of respiratory diseases, especially in children. The country also faces growing external influence that threatens its sovereignty. China controls more than 50% of the Mongolian economy, using this leverage to influence political decisions. When the Dalai Lama visited Mongolia in 2016, China blocked the borders and imposed punitive tariffs, forcing the Mongolian government to promise never to allow the Tibetan spiritual leader to visit again. These external pressures, combined with internal problems, have fueled a resurgence of extreme nationalism. Ultranationalist groups like the Tsagaan Khas, White Swastika, have gained notoriety with attacks against foreigners, particularly Chinese, and with their rhetoric mixing xenophobia with veneration of Genghis Khan. Despite all the challenges Mongolia faces today, the indomitable spirit that allowed these people to create the largest empire in history still pulses strongly in the steppes. The same people who survived centuries of foreign domination, the brutal Soviet experiment, and the most extreme environmental conditions on the planet are now finding new paths to the future. Young Mongolians are leading a silent revolution. A new generation of anti-corruption activists is using social media to demand transparency. Technology startups are emerging in Ulaanbaatar, leveraging the excellent mathematical education inherited from the Soviet era to create solutions that connect this isolated country to the world. In the environmental field, innovative projects are combating desertification. Organizations like Greening the Desert are planting millions of trees on the Gobi border, creating a green wall to halt its advance. Solar and wind energy, perfectly suited for the sunny and windy steppes, are beginning to replace polluting coal. Perhaps most impressive is how Mongolia is reinventing its traditional nomadism for the 21st century. Some nomadic families now use solar panels on their jers, smartphones to follow weather forecasts, and drones to monitor their herds. It's the perfect fusion between an ancient way of life and modern technology. Mongolia's history reminds us that these are people who know resilience like few others. They once ruled the largest land empire in history, and then almost disappeared under foreign domination. They survived Soviet purges, the economic collapse of the 1990s, and some of the harshest winters on the planet. Today, as Mongolia navigates between the influences of China and Russia, seeking its own path, that nomadic spirit, adaptable, resilient, and deeply free, continues to be its greatest strength. From the ashes of Genghis Khan's empire, a new Mongolia is emerging, one that finds strength in its ancient traditions while embracing the possibilities of the future.